Hi everyone. I'm on to section 2.4 in Chemistry of Life. It's Professor Gustin. You might remember from 2.3, I asked you to list the 4 classes of organic molecules. And so hopefully, see if you can do it. Carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, nucleic acids. Okay, so in the next couple of videos, what I'm going to do is we're going to go over each one of these. So Learning Outcome 2.4 says summarize the structure and function of carbohydrates. So if you look at that, carbo sounds like carbon and hydrate sounds like water. So these are organic molecules. They have molecules in them that carbon and water have in it. So they're made of carbon. Remember, water is H2O, so they're made of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen in the ratio of 2 H's for every 1 O, H2O. So that's where the hydrate part comes from. So carbohydrates, they're organic molecules made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And I seem to have a hard time getting the first. There we go. They're made of subunits called monosaccharides. Remember, we said with organic molecules, you have subunits. They're big molecules. They're macromolecules. So they're made of subunits. In the case of carbohydrates, the subunit molecules are called monosaccharides. So mono means one. Saccharide refers to sugar. So monosaccharides, one sugar unit. And that should make sense because the carbohydrates are the starches and the sugars, and I'm going to give you a couple others on top of that. But you're used to that in your diet of carbohydrates being starches and sugars. Primarily in our diet, we use carbohydrates as an energy source. And so we're dependent upon energy sources to keep us running, to keep our energy going so we can function in a normal day and so we can grow and replace cells. So carbohydrates are really our primary energy source. Even if you eat only protein, which, some people try to eat really high protein diets and less carbohydrates. Some of those carbohydrates, some of those proteins are going to be metabolized in a way to help you produce carbohydrates because you always need carbohydrates in your body to feed your cells and to give your cells energy. In plants, they can be structural. So most carbohydrates that we're going to be talking about are energy sources. We're going to use them. Our cells are going to use them to generate energy. But in plants, and I like to point it out because there's some important dietary carbohydrates, some of them are structural, meaning they help make up the parts of the cells. We're mostly made of protein, and we've got some lipid in us, but plants, they have a lot of carbohydrates making up their parts. So here's the same. So I want to compare the structures of simple and complex carbohydrates. And so this is where just the vocabulary starts getting, it can get confusing because we have multiple words meaning the same thing. So when I'm talking about a simple carbohydrate, these are what we would call the monosaccharides and the disaccharides. So we said a monosaccharide is 1 unit of a carbohydrate. And these simple carbohydrates, these monosaccharides, and the disaccharides, which are 2 units of a carbohydrate, or 2 monosaccharides, these are the sugars. And so you've heard of a lot of sugars. You've probably heard of glucose and sucrose and fructose and lactose. All of these are what we would call simple sugars, or I would use the word monosaccharides and disaccharides. So here's one monosaccharide, and they're just showing you how you can draw the same thing 3 different ways. The chemical formula here is C6H12O6. So we've got 6 carbons and 12 hydrogens. You can go around and count those, and 6 oxygens. You can go around and count those. Okay, so that's one, and that happens to be a glucose molecule. And so there's one glucose molecule. And if you want to draw it in a simpler way, you could take out these carbons. And if you want to draw it in a really simple way, you could take out most of the element symbols. And that still just means 1 glucose. It means 1 monosaccharide. It's got 6 carbons. Okay. So if we want to make a disaccharide, you can take 2 monosaccharides and hook them together. this one happens to be when you put glucose and glucose together, you get something called maltose. And notice that there's a chemical bond there. So now we've got one molecule of maltose, a disaccharide. So both of the monosaccharides and disaccharides are what we call simple carbohydrates. Oh, here we go. I have that on there. The two monosaccharides that you probably hear the most about are glucose and fructose. And the most common disaccharides you hear about are sucrose. Well, let me just back up. Glucose is our blood sugar. Fructose is a sugar found in a lot of fruit, although some have other sugars too, but most fructose comes from different fruits. The disaccharides are, well, there's a lot of them, but the ones that we're going to talk about are sucrose and lactose. Sucrose is your table sugar. And so one of the monosaccharides in sucrose is glucose and one is fructose. With lactose, one of the monosaccharides is glucose and one is something called galactose. But just know that these are disaccharides, and lactose happens to be milk sugar. A lot of you are familiar with the concept of being lactose intolerant, and we'll talk about that later on. And I just want to remind you of something we already talked about. How do we make these macromolecules? How do we make these big molecules? These are 4 groups of organic molecules. In this example, they're showing you a glucose plus a glucose. And remember, if we take away water, we do dehydration synthesis. We're going to make a molecule of maltose, in this case, minus a water. If we want to break maltose down into 2 glucoses, you do a hydrolysis. You add a water and you lyse. You break these 2 apart. So we can take 2 monosaccharides and make a disaccharide, or a disaccharide and make 2 monosaccharides. Okay, so we mentioned the simple sugars are the monosaccharides and the disaccharides, the simple carbohydrates. The polysaccharides are the more complex carbohydrates, and you might remember hearing that in your diet. Make sure you eat a lot of complex carbohydrates compared to simple carbohydrates. So they're telling you eat things that are have bigger molecules. The sugars and the starch go into your blood really fast and can change your blood glucose level pretty quickly. The starches go in a little bit slower and it stabilizes your blood sugar a little bit better. So polysaccharides are made of many monosaccharide units. And there's 3 I want you to know the names of. I want you to be able to know the names of these polysaccharides, know that they're polysaccharides, and be able to tell me what their functions are. So there's a polysaccharide called glycogen. Glycogen, it says, these are made from many monosaccharide units. So glycogen is a big, long chain of glucose. So here's a whole bunch of glucoses hooked together. All these little, hexagons are glucose. And so you hook a whole bunch of those together and you get something called glycogen. And if you eat, you eat a normal meal, you're going to have extra carbohydrates. You're not going to use them all immediately in your cells. You want to store some away. So glycogen, this chain of glucose, is a way to take monosaccharides and build them into a bigger molecule that we can store away the carbohydrates for later on. So when you're not eating, your cells still have a demand for carbohydrates, and they're going to tap into that glycogen, this big long chain of glucose. And it can be hundreds of molecules of glucose. These are big molecules. That's why we call them macromolecules. So glycogen is a storage form of glucose. And most of our glycogen is in our muscles. And you can imagine, you keep moving your muscles. They need a constant supply of energy. And it's also in our liver. Our liver stores a lot of glycogen. Another polysaccharide is starch. Now, glycogen is a storage form of glucose in animal cells. Starch is a storage form of glucose in plant cells. And here's a picture of, here's a potato, and these are potato cells, but inside you've got these starch grains. That's what these little things are, these oval-y things. And so you might have some background that you remember that plants get their energy from the sun. So when the sun is out, they're making carbohydrates all the time. But what happens is it's dark half of the day. So the plants need glucose. They need energy to stay alive. So they store away their carbohydrates, their glucose that they made in the sun. They store it in the form of starch. So if glycogen is a storage form of glucose in animal cells, starch is a storage form of glucose in plant cells. And we know a lot about starch because we eat a lot of it. We rely on it for a lot of our energy. The third polysaccharide, which is also a big long chain of glucose, is something called cellulose. If you look at these two cells right here, here's an animal cell, kind of round, and most animal cells are something like that shape. Plant cells, on the other hand, are boxy. And so here's some plant cells, and you can see that they're boxy. So plant cells actually have a box around the cell. And that box around the cell is called the cell wall. And the cell wall is made of cellulose. But just like glycogen and starch, cellulose is also a big long chain of glucose. Now there's a weird thing about cellulose. When we store away glycogen in our cells and we break it down when we need energy. Plants store away starch and we eat it when we need energy. So we're able to break down these polysaccharides. Cellulose, this box around your cell walls of plants, we don't have the ability to break that down. When you see animals like horses and cows surviving on eating just grass, they can do that because they can get energy out of cellulose once it's this big long chain of cellulose. They can actually break apart these molecules. We can't break apart those molecules. So we can't use cellulose for energy. And you might be familiar with cellulose when you hear people talking about diet again, and they say, make sure you eat a lot of fiber. Well, you'll probably remember that, think of any food that has high fiber, it's going to be a plant. Whether it's a nut or an avocado or an apple or any kind of fruit or vegetable, it's going to have a lot of fiber. And the fiber is the cellulose. It's the same stuff. It's the plant cell walls. Now that fiber is an important to our diet, even though we can't get energy from it. So if I look at the next learning outcome, it says, explain the importance of fiber in the diet. Whenever I say fiber, you can say cellulose and remind yourself that cellulose is a polysaccharide and the polysaccharides are carbohydrates. So explain the importance of fiber in the diet. So fiber, some foods have more fiber than others. And we're encouraged to eat these high fiber foods. It does all sorts of good things for us. One of the things fiber does in our diet is it kind of traps cholesterol in our blood and it takes it away. And that's good to keep relatively low cholesterol levels. Fiber is really important in digestion. It can add bulk to our feces, help the food move through your intestinal tract better. If you ever have do you ever notice sometimes you have little small dry poops? Think about what you have been eating. And it probably isn't a lot of plants because plants have the fiber. If you get constipated and you're told, go eat prunes, they tell you to eat prunes because prunes have a lot of fiber. And so that fiber is going to help trap water and add bulk to your feces. And, good healthy feces should look big. You want a lot of bulk to them. It'll help them move through your digestive tract well. Fiber helps you feel fuller. So a lot of times when you're dieting, one of the things you want to do is try to eat a lot of fruits and vegetables, eat a lot of salads and things. You'll feel fuller because the fiber is going to fill you up. The other thing fiber can help do is help stabilize your blood glucose levels. Just like we have a constant pH in our blood, see if you remember what the pH of blood is. I'll give you a second. Did you remember 7.35 to 7.45? That's a good pH. there's a lot of things to hold constant, not just pH. We want to keep our blood sugar, which happens to be glucose. We want to keep our blood glucose level constant. You know, that whole hangry thing. You start getting hangry. You start getting angry because your blood glucose is dropping. Or you might get kind of dizzy or not feel real good if you eat too much sugar and your blood glucose goes up. And so there's some foods that can help keep our blood glucose constant. And it's a lot of times those foods with fiber in them, with the cellulose, that will help keep our blood glucose constant. There's a really funny thing people noticed, that these things are dates and dried dates. Dates have a particularly large amount of fiber in them, but they also have a lot of simple sugars in them, a lot of sweetness. But what they find is if somebody eats dates as opposed to like eating a candy bar, your blood sugar doesn't spike, even though there's a lot of sugar. And scientists are thinking it's because of that fiber in there. A large amount of fiber with your sugar helps stabilize your blood sugar. I put this picture here because I like to make these protein balls. And the basis for the protein balls, there's a lot of dates in them. And I put other things in them. There's all sorts of recipes you can find. But they'll have nuts and maybe some protein powder or who knows what in there to bind them all up. But they can be really good because you can eat something kind of sweet if you're craving something sweet, but it might not spike your blood sugar as much as if you ate like a cookie or a piece of cake if you use dates. The other thing that's good for fiber is reducing the risk of cardiovascular disease in general, helping your blood circulation, helping your heart, preventing stroke, all those kind of things. So eating a lot of fiber in the diet has demonstrated to be a really positive thing. The kinds of foods that have a lot of fiber, nuts, seeds, whole grains, fruits, vegetables, these are plants. So eat plants. I wanted to just touch on this when we're talking about these 3 polysaccharides: starch, the storage form of glucose in plants, glycogen, the storage form of glucose in animals, and cellulose, which is fiber, the cell walls. And they're all made of big chains of glucose. So there's lots of monosaccharides of glucose in this polysaccharide. And here they're showing you there's a couple different kinds of starch. Here's what glycogen looks like. Here's what cellulose looks like. And you notice that they're kind of built, these monosaccharides kind of go together a little bit in unique ways. And so the point I wanted to make is the chemical bonds between the glucose in each one of these molecules is a little bit different. And we just don't have the enzymes or the metabolic machinery to break down cellulose. So we can digest this, we can digest that, but we can't digest cellulose because we don't have the enzymes to do that. So this is why cellulose is fiber. It just runs through our digestive tract without being digested. So there are check your progress in your book. Remember, go to your lecture assignment and go to the where it says reading, and you can find the check your progress 2.4 and see if you can answer questions 1, 2, and 3.